Hi there, welcome back. Well, this is part 3 of the Grundig 90U, and if you've been observant, you'll probably notice that a few things have changed. Namely, this radio stopped smoking. Smoking as in nicotine smoking. It's been cleaned. And the reason I did this is because, quite frankly, it was nauseating. It was smelling really, really badly. And I just couldn't stand to see this for much longer, so I decided to give it the full cleaning job, and it makes one hell of a difference. Usually I do this in stages, and certainly not before I've, done some of the repairs per se. This time I actually did it first. And it took a hell of a lot of alcohol and a hell of a lot of cotton swabs, and as you can see, the remnants are still lying around. But look at this. This is a beauty. So I started off by removing the knobs, and in removing the knobs you get the first indication of the dangers of this so-called auto transformer radio, which is actually hot chassis, or can be hot chassis if you connect it the wrong way around. When you disconnect the knobs, when you take the knobs out and you put the screwdriver in there, if this thing were on, you could have zapped yourself. So the knobs come off, and they're going to get put into some wash-up liquid for a while in warm water, and then brushed down with a toothbrush. So it should come out pretty clean. The next thing is to remove the dial glass, and that you've got to be very, very careful with. This thing is very fragile. What they have is these little clips on the side that you have to bend out. And once you've done that, obviously you'll do that backwards when you put it back in. But once you've done that, you then pull it out slowly. You've got to be careful it doesn't catch on the piano keys or on the tuning knobs, the tuning shafts and the potentiometer shafts. Any little crack, any little pressure can crack this thing. So you have to be incredibly careful. But afterwards, well, it's a question of using a lot of alcohol, and with a fiber brush, natural fiber brush, you brush it off, and you have to be careful too that this gold paint doesn't come off. This is actually a paint, and if you put on too much alcohol, the paint can come off. So this is as much as I'm prepared to risk. Things like the transformers got cleaned up, the wires get cleaned up, and it's looking pretty spiffy. By taking this thing literally a square millimeter at a time, you can get to all the spots and do a decent job of it. I like to see the wires shining and cleaned up, because those really look bad when they left in the original state. The brass items like the fuse holders, I like to use a Dremel on it and bring out the brass again. I also do the same with the rivets on the center of the tube sockets, as you can probably make out. Nothing too extreme. I'm not trying to polish it like I would a diamond. I just want it to look decent. I could probably have gone one step further and actually polish the aluminium on there with Dremel as well, but then it starts looking a little bit artificial. So I try not to do that. Then, of course, the usual trick. Once it's all cleaned up, I brush on a very thin layer of WD-40 on some of these areas, like the transformer covers and anything that's this board, these brown boards. They all look great when you give it a bit of a polish. I don't know how long it's going to last, but it certainly gives it a bit of a protective coating, and these boards do tend to dry over time, so a bit of WD-40 probably gives it another protective layer for some time yet. You'd be surprised just how accessible those nooks and crannies are when you do it very carefully, very slowly, and you use a brush, alcohol, and cotton swabs. You can actually get to every single point in this. It just takes a lot of patience and a lot of time. And especially in places like this one, the Faraday antenna, a heck of a lot of care, because if you're not careful, you will damage the wires over there. Those wires are incredibly fine, so you have to do it very, very, very carefully. You do not want to rip those up, believe me. It's a nightmare to fix that later, especially since sometimes you can't even see that they're broken. But yeah, the result is very pleasing. It's now a lot easier to work on, for me anyway. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn it upside down and basically do a full recap of all the caps that I deem necessary for replacement. And those are pretty usual. All the ones that I see there that are not those mica ones or polystyrene ones, I think they're called polyesters, they all get replaced. And then when that is done, we'll be ready for the test. So I'm just going to get on with it. Well, here we are. All the capacitors that need changing have been changed. You can see them, all the brown ones over here. There's some that were, well, kind of tricky to get to say the least. This being a very small chassis, everything is very, very compact in here. So sometimes getting in there is a bit of a problem. And what I found is that whoever had replaced some of these capacitors had done a pretty bad job, as you probably noticed in the previous video. They had very little idea of how to do any soldering. So in some cases they made quite a mess of it, and I had to repair things, like some of the connections were a little bit suspect. But I replaced them all because although some of them seemingly were new, I just didn't trust them anymore. They had to be removed so that I could refit them. So I thought I'd just remove them completely. And I've got all the capacitors on the bench here. I'll show you in a minute. There's a variety. You can see some of them original. Some of them obviously have been changed, but they all went. And I don't feel sorry for that. It just gives me a lot more confidence knowing that I now know what I've put in here. So that's it. That's our recapping. And we've got two electrolytics. That's the, over here, if you can barely see that, that is the cathode bypass capacitor for the EL84. That electrolytic down here, under there, is the 5 microfarad. I replaced it with the 4.7 microfarad. That is from the FM ratio detector. And other than that, nothing else needed changing. And the reason is very simple. Some of these resistors are incredibly accurate. I mean, I've measured quite a few just to make sure that they were within spec. I was hoping they were within spec. They weren't within spec. They were like 1% off, some of them. And I find that amazing on some of these old radios. The resistors, they're either completely gone or, as in this case, I mean, there's one that's 30K, and I think the reading was 30.01K. It's ridiculously accurate. So I left well enough alone. Also, because of the readings, because of the capacitor resistor values they've got on here, they've got a lot of values here that you don't really get anymore. Things like 30K, 5K, 2K. So if I replaced that, I'd have to replace that 30K with, well, 27. I'd either do that or I'd have to put a 2 in series. And in this case, I'm able to leave the exact values as is, but they were very, very close. And the only ones I didn't change capacitor-wise are things like that one there, that polystyrene. Those generally hold their value very, very well. And other than that, there's not much else to do on here. So what I'm going to do is flip this over and show you the result, in terms of function, that is. But before we get to that, this is the result of the recapping. You see, you've got things like this here, which seem to be new. These film caps, these here were new. So these of course are the originals, and this seems to have been changed some time ago. This was the ratio detector cap, the 5 microfarads. That might have been original. This was new, but hey, I'm feeling a lot more confident now that this thing will last a long time with all the capacitors swapped out. Alright, time to test this thing. I'm going to connect the mini whip. I'll connect it first to the AM. So the mini whip's on. I'll give it 2 light bulbs. Switch it on there, and let's put it on medium wave. Volume up.
Me estoy cansando, uno piensa... Me pongo la corona porque soy el rey. Y manocar.
De los partidos, sean en casa o sean fuera.
También la del sábado y nada, ánimo. Gracias por estar.
Now that is pretty lively. That's a very good reception. And I've done absolutely no alignment yet. Okay, let's try long wave. This, I think, is North Africa. This is middle of the afternoon, so I don't expect much. There's the beacon. And we'll try FM, and I'll just change the mini whip to the FM. I don't actually use the mini whip on FM. I've got the long wire selected there, which seems to work very, very well.
Da sua ascensão ao trono foi feito pelo general que foi dos assassinos, deixando uma shakespeariana mancha de sangue e de remorso.
Tone control's working.
Que durou até 1825.
De resposta à pandemia vai duplicar os fundos.
Seems to be a bit of distortion there.
Norte e centro, previsão de aguaceiros e mesmo de trovoadas dispersas. Esta hora 24 graus aqui na cidade de Lisboa, 23 no Porto e também em Faro, 21 no Funchal, 17 em Ponta Delgada. Augusto Henriques com a edição Antena 1.
O número de mortos e de infectados por Covid-19 baixou nas últimas 24 horas. O balanço da Direção-Geral de Saúde dá conta de mais de...
O GNE há plena disponibilidade para manter essa...
It's slightly out of alignment. That there is showing on 80, almost 89, 88.7 or so. That's actually on 88. The other thing I've noticed is that at the end here, I want to actually do something. There's a station up here where I live at 101.6, and this is not catching that. And usually what I can do is I can just do the alignment and just move the dial up and catch it. So when I do the FM alignment, I'm going to do a front end alignment as well, oscillator and RF alignment. And I'll probably be able to bring in that station into the 100, because this is supposed to go to 100. but I can move it just slightly. I don't really care that the position on the dial is exact. I don't have that many stations that I need to keep track of where they are. I know more or less where they are, but I would like to catch that one. So this thing's working pretty well, very well indeed. I think there's a little bit of distortion. This could be due to the fact that I've changed that ratio detector cap. That sometimes requires alignment, and I will be doing an alignment. The point is, this thing is actually sounding very, very good. And the other thing I've noticed is that the buzz, the hum, it's there, but it's not as bad as it used to be. I think some of those capacitors were contributing to the hum that we were getting. It does have to do with the fact that, well, when I connect the chassis to the earth, the hum was diminishing quite a bit. So it does have to do with the fact that the isolation transformer is picking up quite a bit of hum over there. But it's certainly improved dramatically. So I'm very, very pleased with this. I'm really, really pleased with this. And just to answer a question regarding the mini whip, let me show you something. This is my antenna selector. And what I've got here is I've got two antennas coming in here. One is the mini whip and the one is the long wire. And here I can just select between long wire at the top or mini whip down below. This thing's got its own power supply. It required very, very little current for the mini whip. So I put in a small transformer and basically built a linear power supply in there. And this here was supposed to be to select 3 outputs. But because I'm using everything on the bench here, that labeling, forget it, that's just the output. I had a switch here where I was selecting output 1 to A, B, or C. A was coming to the bench, B was going to the shelves, and C was going to the lounge where I've got another receiver. But I've decided just to focus it on here. So this labeling still needs to be redone. But as you can see, when I'm using the mini whip, that's on, that's down. When I use long wire, I can just flick it on there. And long wire works very, very well for FM where I am. Not so much. The mini whip doesn't do much. And in that case, I can actually have it off and the long wire still acts as an FM antenna. And that's why I keep talking about long wire versus mini whip. This is using those modular systems that I mentioned in one of my videos where they clip under here. I've got another one for the dummy load. I'm rebuilding the attenuator, and I'll probably do I've got another 1 or 2 ideas of what I want to put on the shelf here that they hook underneath, and it's actually quite useful. I can move them backwards and forwards if I wish. And if you are really, really observant, you'll notice this thing's got a new, what do they call this? I don't know what to call this. It's a bracket. The one I was using, I used for the big radios. It was far too big for this, so I just I bought a 1 meter length of aluminium, bent it, and I'm now using this one for small radios like this one, which makes a lot more sense. It's just easier to work with, and they can still be flipped around like I do the other one. I cleaned the glass faceplate very carefully, very, very carefully. Replaced the protection along the edges with that adhesive tape so that it doesn't actually scratch against the metal. This thing was put back in. The knobs were cleaned and polished. You can see the brass now. I like it. Those knobs had already shown you. Those were perfect. They came out beautifully. This back plate over here, I had removed it and I decided just to respray it. I used creamy off-white, and you can now see better through there. So I'm happy with that result. And overall, I'm very, very pleased with progress. The only thing outstanding now is I need to do an IF alignment for the AM bands and for the FM. Probably a bit of RF alignment as well, front-end alignment. Definitely for the FM, I want to do that stretching of the band. That might be instructive. I've done it before and it worked quite well, so I might do it here. Well, I want to thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this, please click like, share, subscribe, and all that jazz. And if you want to support the channel directly, you can do so on Patreon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now, and keep safe.